Within an hour of my arrival at Fort Union, my new post, my best friend Johnny came to the barracks, with a broad grin and a friendly clout on the shoulder. He'd hurried over as soon as he heard I had come, and we talked till sunset and beyond. As soon as Johnny mentioned Celia's name, I knew he had it bad for her. To hear him talk, Celia was the most amazing woman who had ever graced God's green earth. She was the sister-in-law of the captain, and all the young men on the base were infatuated with her. Celia was the prettiest of the eligible ladies that graced Fort Union society. She liked the spice of adventure to be found so near the wilds. Johnny alternated between elation when Celia talked with him, and despair when she flirted with another man. I watched their courtship from afar and was troubled. There was something about Celia that I didn't like. I never mentioned it to Johnny, but I thought she was too much of a flirt. I wished Johnny had fallen for a nicer woman. About a month after I arrived at Fort Union, a birthday dance was given for one of the officers. To Johnny's elation, Celia agreed to be his partner at the dance. Johnny was dancing on cloud nine all night, until a messenger came gasping into the room to report an Apache raid. With a small scream of terror, Celia clung shamelessly to Johnny and begged him not to go, even though he was the lieutenant put in charge of the mission. Well, sir, Johnny proposed to her right then and there, and Celia accepted. Furthermore, Celia told Johnny that she would wait for him, and that if he didn't come back, she would never marry. I doubted Celia's sincerity, but Johnny just ate it up. I was assigned to Johnny's troop, so I had to leave too. We started out the next morning, and had a rough week trekking down and fighting the Apaches. Johnny split up the troop, taking command of the first group and giving me command of the second. My men reached the rendezvous point with no casualties, but only half of the other group arrived, and Johnny was not among them. They'd been ambushed by the Apaches. I had to take command of the troop. We searched for survivors, but never found Johnny's body. As soon as I could, I ordered the men to turn for home. Celia made a terrible, heart-rending scene when she found out Johnny was missing. She flung herself into my arms when I gave her the news and sobbed becomingly. The display turned my stomach. It was so obviously insincere. I excused myself hastily and left her to the administrations of the other soldiers. From that time on, I was careful to stay away from Celia, who mourned less than a week for my friend before resuming her flirtatious ways. About a month later, a rich, handsome lieutenant arrived at Fort Union. He rose from the east, and Celia took a real shine to him. Johnny was completely forgotten, and so was her promise to him. It wasn't long before Celia and the lieutenant were engaged and started planning a big wedding. Nothing but the very best would suit Celia, and her bridegroom had the money to indulge her. Everyone at Fort Union was invited to the ceremony, and the weather was perfect on the day of the wedding. Everyone turned out in their best clothes, and the wedding was a social success. After the ceremony, all the guests were invited to a celebratory ball. We were waltzing around the ballroom when the door flew open with a loud bang. A gust of cold air blew in, dimming the candles. A heart-wrenching wail echoed through the room. The music stopped abruptly, and everyone turned to look at the door. Standing there was a swollen, dead body of a soldier. It was dressed in an officer's uniform. The eyes were burning with a terrible fire. The temple had a huge gash from a hatchet blow. There was no scalp. It was Johnny. The whole crowd stood silent, as if in a trance. No one moved. No one murmured. I wanted to cry out when I recognized Johnny, but I was struck dumb like the rest of the wedding guests. Johnny walked across the room and took Celia out of the bridegroom's arms. She was frozen in horror and could not resist. Johnny looked at the musicians. Still in a trance, they began to play a horrible, demonic-sounding waltz. Johnny and Celia began to dance. They swept around and around the room, doing an intricate waltz. Johnny held the white-clad bride tight against his dead body, while a deathly pallor crept over her face. Her steps slowed, but still Johnny held her tight and moved them around in a grisly parody of a waltz. Celia's eyes bulged. She turned as white as her gown and her mouth sagged open. She gave one small gasp and died in his arms. Johnny dropped Celia's body on the floor and stood over her, wringing his blood-stained hands. He threw back his head and gave another unearthly wail that echoed across the room. Then he vanished through the door. Released from the trance, the crowd gasped and exclaimed. The bridegroom ran to Celia and knelt beside her, wringing his hands in the same manner as Johnny. His cries were all too human. Unable to bear the sight of the stricken bridegroom, I took my captain aside and asked permission to take a small detail back to the place where our troop had been attacked by the Apaches, to search once more for my dead friend. He sent a dozen men with me. We combed the area, and finally found Johnny's body hidden in a crevice. It looked exactly the same as it had appeared on the night of Celia's wedding. We brought Johnny back to the fort with us, and the captain buried him beside Celia. Celia's bridegroom went back east shortly after we buried Johnny, and I resigned my commission a few days later and went home, never wanting to see that cursed place again. I heard later that Celia's ghost was often seen at dusk, weeping over Johnny's grave, but I never went back to Fort Union to see it for myself. When Felix Agnes put up the life-sized shrouded bronze statue of a grieving angel, seated on a pedestal, in the Agnes family plot in the Druid Ridge Cemetery, he had no idea what he had started. The statue was a rather eerie figure by day, frozen in a moment of grief and terrible pain. At night, the figure was almost unbelievably creepy, the shroud over its head obscuring the face until you were up close to it. There was a living air about the grieving angel, as if its arms could really reach out and grab you if you weren't careful. It didn't take long for rumors to sweep through the town and surrounding countryside. They said that the statue, nicknamed Black Aggie, was haunted by the spirit of a mistreated wife who lay beneath her feet. The statue's eyes would glow red at the stroke of midnight, and any living person who returned the statue's gaze would instantly be struck blind. Any pregnant woman who passed through her shadow would miscarry. If you sat on her lap at night, the statue would come to life and crush you to death in her dark embrace. If you spoke Black Aggie's name 3 times at midnight in front of a black mirror, the evil angel would appear and pull you down to hell. They also said that spirits of the dead would rise from their graves on dark nights to gather around the statue at night. People began visiting the cemetery just to see the statue, and it was then that the local fraternity decided to make the statue of grief part of their initiation rites. Black Aggie sitting, where candidates for membership had to spend the night crouched beneath the statue with their backs to the grave of General Agnes, became popular. One dark night, 2 fraternity members accompanied New Hopeful to the cemetery and watched while he took his place underneath the creepy statue. The clouds had obscured the moon that night, and the whole area surrounding the dark statue was filled with a sense of anger and malice. It felt as if a storm were brewing in that part of the cemetery, and to their chagrin, the 2 fraternity members noticed that gray shadow seemed to be clustering around the body of the frightened fraternity candidate crouching in front of the statue. What had been a funny initiation rite suddenly took on an air of danger. One of the fraternity brothers stepped forward in alarm to call out to the initiate. As he did, the statue above the boy stirred ominously. The 2 fraternity brothers froze in shock as the shrouded head turned toward the new candidate. They saw the gleam of glowing red eyes beneath the concealing hood as the statue's arms reached out toward the cowering boy. With shouts of alarm, the fraternity brothers leapt forward to rescue the new initiate, but it was too late. The initiate gave one horrified yell, and then his body disappeared into the embrace of the dark angel. The fraternity brothers skidded to a halt as the statue thoughtfully rested its glowing eyes upon them. With gasps of terror, the boys fled from the cemetery before the statue could grab them too. Hearing the screams, a night watchman hurried to the Agnes plot. To his chagrin, he discovered the body of a young man lying at the foot of the statue. The young man had apparently died of fright. The disruption caused by the statue grew so acute that the Agnes family finally donated it to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. The grieving angel sat for many years in storage there, never again to plague the citizens visiting the Druid Hill Park Cemetery. She lived deep in the forest in a tiny cottage, and sold herbal remedies for a living. Folks living in the town nearby called her Bloody Mary, and said she was a witch. None dared cross the old crone for fear that their cows would go dry, their food stores rot away before winter, their children take sick of fever, or any number of terrible things that an angry witch could do to her neighbors. Then the little girls in the village began to disappear, one by one. No one could find out where they had gone. Grief-stricken families searched the woods, the local buildings, and all the houses and barns, but there was no sign of the missing girls. A few brave souls even went to Bloody Mary's home in the woods to see if the witch had taken the girls. but she denied any knowledge of the disappearances. Still, it was noted that her haggard appearance had changed. She looked younger, more attractive. The neighbors were suspicious, but they could find no proof that the witch had taken their young ones. Then came the night when the daughter of the miller rose from her bed and walked outside, following an enchanted sound no one else could hear. The miller's wife had a toothache and was sitting up in the kitchen treating the tooth with an herbal remedy when her daughter left the house. She screamed for her husband and followed the girl out the door. The miller came running in his nightshirt. Together, they tried to restrain the girl, but she kept breaking away from them and heading out of town. The desperate cries of the miller and his wife woke the neighbors. They came to assist the frantic couple. Suddenly, a sharp-eyed farmer gave a shout and pointed towards a strange light at the edge of the woods. A few townsmen followed him out into the field and saw Bloody Mary, standing beside a large oak tree, holding a magic wand that was pointed towards the miller's house. She was glowing with an unearthly light as she set her evil spell upon the miller's daughter. The townsmen grabbed their guns and their pitchforks and ran toward the witch. When she heard the commotion, Bloody Mary broke off her spell and fled back into the woods. The far-sighted farmer had loaded his gun with silver bullets in case the witch ever came after his daughter. Now he took aim and shot at her. The bullet hit Bloody Mary in the hip and she fell to the ground. The angry townsmen leapt upon her and carried her back into the field, where they built a huge bonfire and burned her at the stake. As she burned, Bloody Mary screamed a curse at the villagers. If anyone mentioned her name aloud before a mirror, she would send her spirit to revenge herself upon them for her terrible death. When she was dead, the villagers went to the house in the wood and found the unmarked graves of the little girls the evil witch had murdered. She had used their blood to make her young again. From that day to this, anyone foolish enough to chant Bloody Mary's name 3 times before a darkened mirror will summon the vengeful spirit of the witch. It is said that she will tear their bodies to pieces and rip their souls from their mutilated bodies. The souls of these unfortunate ones will burn in torment as Bloody Mary once was burned, and they will be trapped forever in the mirror. Mad Henry was a hermit who lived alone in a decrepit mansion at the edge of town. Rumors were rife about the wild-eyed man. Some folks said that he was a magician who called upon the powers of darkness to wreak havoc upon his neighbors. Others called him a mad doctor who could restore life to foul corpses from the local cemetery. No respectable citizen in town had anything to do with Mad Henry. Then, one year, a new family moved to town with a lovely daughter, Rachel, who caught Mad Henry's eye. He showered the maiden with gifts, goblets of pure gold, necklaces of pearls, and a pot of daisies that never dropped a single petal. Despite the gifts, Rachel fell in love with another, Joffrey, a handsome young man just home from university. A week after meeting, they eloped, leaving behind a stunned Mad Henry. When Rachel and Joffrey returned from the elopement, they threw a big ball and invited everyone in town. While Rachel was waltzing with her father, she heard a clap of thunder. Lightning flashed again and again. Suddenly, the double doors blew open and a breeze whirled in, bringing with it the smell of dead, decaying things. Mad Henry loomed in the doorway, pupils gleaming red with anger. He was followed by the grotesque figures of the dead, who came marching 2 by 2 into the room. Their eye sockets glowed with blue fire as they surrounded the room. 2 of the corpses captured Joffrey and threw him down at the feet of their lord. Red eyes gleaming, Mad Henry drew a silver-bladed knife and casually cut the bridegroom's throat from ear to ear. Rachel screamed and ran forward, pushing through the foul, stinking corpses of the dead, and flung herself upon her dying husband. "Kill us both!" she cried desperately. But Mad Henry plucked the last out of the pool of blood surrounding her dead husband and carried her out into the thundering night. Behind him, the army of the dead turned from the grisly scene and followed their master. The sounds of thunder and lightning faded away as the alchemist and his dead companions disappeared into the dark night. Joffrey's father and Rachel's father gathered a small mob and followed the evil hermit, intent upon saving Rachel. When they searched Mad Henry's house, they found it completely empty, save for a light, which shone from a series of mysterious globes that bobbed near the ceiling of each room. Mad Henry had vanished. Search parties scoured the countryside for days, but turned up nothing. Joffrey was buried in the local cemetery, and the dance hall was torn down. No one in town spoke about what had happened, and no one dared imagine what had become of poor Rachel. A year to the day after the ball, A timid knock sounded upon the door of Rachel's parents' home. When her father opened it, he saw a gaunt, gray figure on the stoop, her eyes full with exhaustion and pain. It was Rachel. Her tongue had been cut out so she couldn't speak. But when she produced a knife from her tattered garments, the knife with the silver blade that they had last seen in the hands of Mad Henry, the gleam of satisfaction in Rachel's eyes told them that the streaks of blood that coated the knife were those of Mad Henry. That night, Rachel died in her sleep, with a peaceful smile upon her ravaged face. She was sophisticated, poised, and cultured. In retrospect, this should have made them suspicious. A teacher like her should be presiding over a girls' school in London, or New York, not seeking a position in a small town in Georgia. But at the time, they were too delighted by her application to ask any questions. "It'll be good for our daughter to learn some culture," the attorney's wife told the pastor's wife. "And our boy may find some table manners at last," the pastor's wife responded with a smile. School was called into session in the local church shortly after the arrival of the teacher, and soon the children were bringing glowing reports home. Teacher was special. Teacher taught the manners and diction as well as reading, writing, and arithmetic. All the children loved Teacher. The parents were delighted by the progress their children were making at school. Teacher had been a real find, a godsend, said the preacher's wife. But not everyone in town was so satisfied. The local never-do-well, called Smith, had more sinister stories to tell. "That woman ain't natural," he told the blacksmith, waving a bottle of whiskey for emphasis. "I seen her out in the woods after dark, dancing around a campfire and chanting in a strange language." "Nonsense," the blacksmith retorted, calmly hammering a headed iron bar on his anvil. "They say she's got an altar in her room, and it ain't an altar to the Almighty," Smith insisted, leaning forward and blowing his boozy breath into the blacksmith's face. "You're drunk," said the blacksmith, lifting the hot iron so it barred the man from coming any closer. "Go home and sleep it off." Smith left the smithy, but he continued to talk wild about the teacher in the weeks that followed. During those weeks, a change gradually came over the school children. The typical hijinks and pranks that all children played lessened. Their laughter died away, and when they did misbehave, it was on a much more ominous scale than before. Items began to disappear from houses and farms, expensive items like jewelry, farm tools, and money. When children talked back to their parents, there was a hard edge to their voices, and they did not apologize for their rudeness, even when punished. "And my daughter lied to me the other day," the attorney's wife said to the pastor's wife in distress. "I saw her punch her younger brother and steal an apple from him, and she denied it to my face. She practically called me a liar." "The games the children play back in the woods frighten me," the pastor's wife confessed. "They chant in a strange language, and they move in such a strange manner, almost like a ritual dance." "Could it be something they are learning at school?" asked the attorney's wife. "Surely not. Teacher is such a sweet, sophisticated lady," said the pastor's wife. But they exchanged uneasy glances. Smith, on the other hand, was sure. "That teacher is turning the young'uns to the devil. That's what she's doing," he proclaimed up and down the streets of the town. "Don't be ridiculous," the preacher told him when they passed in front of the mercantile. "I ain't ridiculous. You are blind," Smith told him. "That teacher ought to be burned at the stake, like they burned the witches in Salem." The pastor, pale with wrath, ordered Smith out of his sight. But the never-do-well's words rang in his mind, and would not be pushed away, and the children continued to behave oddly, almost like they were possessed. He would, the preacher decided reluctantly, have to look into it some day soon. That day came sooner than he thought. The very next Monday, his little boy came down with a cold, and his mother kept him home from school. When the pastor returned from his duties for a late lunch, his wife came running up to him as soon as he entered the door. She was pale with fright. "I heard him chanting something over and over again in his bedroom," she gasped. "So I crept to the door to listen. He was saying the Lord's Prayer backwards." The pastor gasped and clutched his Bible to his chest, as goosebumps erupted over his body. This was positively satanic, and there was nowhere the boy could have learned such a thing in this town, unless he learned it at school. At that moment, the attorney's wife came bursting in the door behind him. "Quick, pastor, quick!" she cried. "Smith is running through the town with a torch, talking about burning down the school. The children are still in class." The pastor raced out of the house with the two women at his heels. They and the other townsfolk who followed them were met by a huge cloud of smoke coming from the direction of the church, where the children had their lessons. The building was already ablaze as frantic parents beat at the flames with wet sacks, or threw buckets of water from the pump into the inferno. Smith could be heard cackling unrepentantly from the far side of the building, which was full of the screams of the trapped students and their teacher. The fire blazed with a supernatural kind of force, and the pastor thought he heard the sound of the teacher laughing from within the building, when it became apparent that no one could be saved. The church burnt for several hours, and when it was finally extinguished, there was nothing left. Mourning parents tried to find something of their children to bury, and Smith wisely disappeared from town, his mission against the works of Satan completed. The teacher's burnt body was buried deep in the ground and covered with brick tomb. The children's smaller bodies were interred beneath wooden crosses. Of all the students in the school that fall, only the pastor's small son survived. To this day, voices can be heard in the graveyard at the burnt church, chanting unintelligible words, as the school children and the teacher once chanted in the woods outside town. Sometimes apparitions are seen, and dark walkers who roam the graveyard at night, and they say that a brick taken from the grave of the evil teacher can set fire to objects on which they are placed. Susan and Ned were driving through a wooded, empty section of highway. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, the sky went dark in the torrential downpour. "We'd better stop," said Susan. Ned nodded his head in agreement. He stepped on the brake, and suddenly the car started to slide on the slick pavement. They plunged off the road and slid to a halt at the bottom of an incline. Pale and shaking, Ned quickly turned to check if Susan was all right. When she nodded, Ned relaxed and looked through the rain-soaked windows. "I'm going to see how bad it is," he told Susan, and went out into the storm. She saw his blurry figure in the headlight, walking around the front of the car. A moment later, he jumped in beside her, soaking wet. "The car's not badly damaged, but we are wheel-deep in mud," he said. "I'm going to have to go for help." Susan swallowed nervously. There would be no quick rescue here. He told her to turn off the headlights and lock the doors until he returned. Axe Murder Hollow. Although Ned hadn't said the name aloud, they both knew what he had been thinking when he told her to lock the car. This was the place where a man had once taken an axe and hacked his wife to death in a jealous rage over an alleged affair. Supposedly, the axe-wielding spirit of the husband continued to haunt the section of the road. Outside the car, Susan heard a shriek, a loud thump, and a strange gurgling noise, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. Frightened, she shrank down into her seat. She sat in silence for a while, then she noticed another sound. It was a soft sound, like something being blown by the wind. Suddenly, the car was illuminated by a bright light. An official-sounding voice told her to get out of the car. Ned must have found a police officer. Susan unlocked the door and stepped out of the car. As her eyes adjusted to the bright light, she saw it. Hanging by his feet from the tree next to the car was the dead body of Ned. His bloody throat had been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. The wind swung his corpse back and forth, so that it thumped against the tree. Susan screamed and ran toward the voice and the light. As she drew close, she realized the light was not coming from a flashlight. Standing there was the glowing figure of a man, with a smile on his face, and a large, solid, indefinitely real axe in his hands. She backed away from the glowing figure, until she bumped into the car. "Playing around when my back was turned," the ghost whispered, stroking the sharp blade of the axe with his fingers. "You've been very naughty." The last thing she saw was the glint of the axe blade in the eerie, incandescent light. Hello, this is Hollowkeez. This video is different in that it's the first I made with fictional stories. I hope I picked out some good ones for you guys, and that they were at least pretty unnerving for you. I will admit that fictional stories are not my favorites, but we've got to shake it up every once in a while, eh? Oh, and thanks Megan Kim for giving me the advice that you did. I wouldn't have been able to tell these stories if it wasn't for you. Anyway, some of you may have noticed my uploads are a bit random. While I can't promise anything, I do want to upload at a slightly more frequent basis. We'll see what happens. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day. Don't let the demons bite. If it's fear you're after, welcome home.